In this episode, I'd like to discuss the history of the Papa grounds, the stranger grounds, the Mexican grounds, the African American grounds. A section here at Oakwood Cemetery that for many years has been used by many different races, and the events that led to a false assumption by city leaders as well as a city councilwoman. Okay, this is the 40 acres of Oakwood Cemetery right here. This area here is Oakwood Annex. We're going to concentrate on this area right here. That is, here's the Oakwood Cemetery, here's the chapel building. Now, in this particular map, I'm going to slide this way, get to more center screen. This is the chapel building, and you can see the fencing that was put up during the chapel remodeling here. Chapel was built in 1914. On top of, as it turns out, this area here, there are burials underneath the chapel. They removed 35 bodies from underneath the chapel floor, and there are lots of bodies around the outside. I've done other videos that will display that. What came into question was how this area here was called, how it was used. I'm going to lead you through some maps from the city from 1976, some current maps that were done by Mr. Robert Tiemann, who had taken on this project many years doing a headstone registry. And we're going to discuss how some misunderstandings from city leadership led to the false assumption that this was all an African American burial ground, from this road here across this way, down here, and back to here. This area here, without question, is African American. There are African Americans in through here that are post 1900. Again, this was built in 1914. We're concerned about how this area was used between 1836 and about 1891. We do know that there are Hispanics here, Hispanics over in here, and Anglos back off in this area here. We do know that there's a large, this area right in here, zooming in, is a high density of African Americans, but they're post-1910. And what happened is the city repurposes the old Papa grounds and starts reusing it in the 20th century for burials. So that's where a lot of the confusion comes in. Let's take a look at the 1976 city map. This is a map from 1976. Here you can see the chapel down here at the bottom center of your screen. Here you can see the area to the right is 25 by 30 foot lots. And they were sold out for families. So if you had a family lot, then you could be buried in your family lot. Now, looking right here, some of these lots, this lot was owned by Travis County. These were Papa grounds here. So it wasn't just this area here. You had paupers being buried off on these areas, but most of these, for the most part, were family lots. The area to your screen right is the area in question here. West Avenue is a dirt road that comes through here. And you notice the city doesn't define this in any manner whatsoever at all. There's no label on this that says colored grounds, Mexican grounds, stranger grounds, any of those titles. Those are all denoted in the day books, but not clearly on any maps. We do know the maps were made at one time. Maps didn't survive. They have been lost or destroyed. In many cases, older cemeteries, they would repurpose areas and rebury people in older burial grounds, assuming that the remains had gone back to earth. This is a set of 5 maps done by Robert Tiemann, who is not a city official, who was working on a headstone registry for a 40-acre cemetery known as Oakwood. Mr. Tiemann took the 4 section maps from 1976 using drafting skills and created a set of cleaner maps that clearly show out the layout of the cemetery. And so this is section 1. This is section 2. This is section 3. And here's Bob's interpretation of Section 4. And this is where the confusion started to happen. And again, there's not a city map, not adopted by the city, but this big open area, because it was not divided into family lots. Bob referred to it as colored ground Section A and colored ground Section B, based on the headstones that he saw here, regardless of when they were put into place. Now again, this area here, when you look at the day books, was primarily for paupers, people who didn't have money to afford a family plot that would have been represented in these bigger areas. People that were poor necessarily didn't afford a headstone, or perhaps they used a rock or a wooden cross that wouldn't survive time. This area was used from 1839 forward. In 1891, newspapers shows this area completely full. And then in 1914, the chapel building is erected on top of burials that, whether they were known or not at the time, we can only speculate. So when the city came in and said, oh my God, we've got burials underneath the chapel, we need to stop, we need to decide what to do with those burials. Kim McKnight, Tanja Walls Davis, who is the cemetery manager, and Orr Houston walked this site, and then they made a public disclosure, and in the public meetings, they falsely made the assumption that all of these were African American in nature. This is actually a PowerPoint presentation of a report that was done for the city of Austin by Terry Merca of Save Austin Cemeteries. This was done and given to the city on April the 21st, after the city started having public meetings and spoke out with the misunderstanding that this was all African American burials. A lot of us who had done research in this area brought it to the city's attention, but they didn't want to acknowledge the fact that there were other races buried in this area. And so we did a report. And so I'm not going to read this to you screen by screen. I'm going to pull up a screen, I'm going to count to 5, and then I'll change screens. So if you want to read it, you can look at each screen individually. All right, this is the final page and the recommendations from Save Austin Cemeteries. I'm going to go over these real quickly. We ask that they review the findings, and if they agree, communicate them to the groups who have come to the conclusion that the chapel was built upon Negro graves. And this is using specific words from the Carver Museum talk given on April the 11th of 2017 at the community meeting. We had some concern because this was turning into a Black Lives Matter, and at Save Austin Cemeteries, we believe that all lives matter, that the politics belong outside of the gate. If the park department does have burial records that contradict the findings in the report, to please share them with us so that we could reevaluate the conclusions. We want to expand the impacted community to include representatives from all races believed to be buried in the area. We want to consider renaming the current colored grounds, as they come to known unofficially, to something more appropriate for the diverse Austin community buried there, such as the public burial grounds or the community burial grounds, and to add lot numbers, and so that the burials in the area could be mapped more easily for family research, and people could locate graves. To work with Save Austin Cemeteries, which is the nonprofit 501c3 that had been working with the Parks Department at this point for the better part of 13 years at absolutely no cost to the city, so we can improve the burial records management managed by the Parks Department and the Austin History Center, and the online thing to correct any assumptions and transcription errors. We at SAC would like to view any headstones that were located underneath the chapel, so that we can assist in identifying the burials near or under the chapel, and to work with Save Austin Cemeteries to develop a comprehensive plan to improve the condition of the existing headstones in this area. Now again, headstones are considered the private properties of families. The city has no obligation, and in fact, they state that they're private property, and the city cannot spend public money on private property. That's why the partnership with Save Austin Cemeteries is so important, because the taxpayers should not and cannot be burdened with the cost of doing a program like this. Save Austin Cemeteries was established to do just that. This is an email from Terry Merca, who was on the board at Save Austin Cemeteries at the time, dated April the 19th. It's sent to Kevin Johnson, who was the project manager over the thing, the chapel remodeling, Kim McKnight, who was a resource manager, and Tanja Walls Davis, who is the cemetery manager and still is the cemetery manager. Terry thanks them for the comprehensive approach they're taking on gathering the feedback from the Austin community in the chapel area. To ensure there's an accurate understanding of the diversity of the burials in the specific area, Save Austin Cemetery Group has conducted extensive research, which summarized the attached document. The conclusion of our work is that the chapel area was likely first used as the Mexican grounds and stranger grounds during the 1870s, but there were just a few headstones erected since the burials were likely of people who had very little money. There were several headstones near the chapel with other evidence demonstrating this usage. Given this, we strongly recommend that the community of impact be broadened to more accurately reflect the diversity of the groups likely buried underneath the chapel. We offered to walk the group through the detailed research. If they had any research that contradicted our findings, we'd certainly like to know that. Please let us know if we can do any other information or further clarification. Thank you. Now, this is how the council member, or Houston, responded back. She goes on to state that in late 2016, when she was informed about the remains under the chapel, that she had contacted a Black Baptist minister or rabbi and an Hispanic priest in case the community's decision was to exhume the remains and bury them in another location. Her thought was that although the official documents say colored grounds, and again, there are no official documents or maps that list this as colored grounds. This is a Bob Tiemann map that was adopted by Save Austin Cemeteries, that the city of Austin chose to use because it was a better graphic than what they had. Her thought was, although the official documents say colored grounds, that did not, in the 1800s, indicate that only colored remains would be buried in that section. She believes and believes now that the majority of the remains under and to the north of the chapel are Americans of African descent. Now, I can't speak for the people underneath, but I know the people north of it are Anglos. Some to the west of it are Hispanic. That is why the department and her office has reached out to people of color to provide them information about the best practices and receive their suggestions regarding opinions. And that's fine, because it affects the whole community. But unfortunately, when I attended every one of these meetings, and they held several across the city, it was very clearly a Black Lives Matter, us against them, which is why we felt it's important to bring that information forward so they didn't get caught later on unexpectedly finding out that, oops, perhaps these aren't blacks underneath the building. And she goes on to say, unfortunately, it is her belief that the new research on the diverse burials is a way to deflect the opportunity for the black community to make decisions and refocus the conversation about other demographics that may have been buried in the colored grounds. Again, so here's how she's really feeling right here. She doesn't want any more new research. That she feels very important that the black community is the one that's going to make the decisions and not any other demographics that may have been buried in the colored grounds. Unequivocally, there are people of all races buried in the areas that Bob Tiemann defined as the colored grounds. Never been defined by map or any other way defining that geographic space as the colored grounds. She asked them if they have any information about the names, ethnicity, slaves, or freed of the individuals buried in, again, the colored grounds. Please share. Now, again, these people who are doing this are running museums and other things. They're not equipped, nor do they have the time or inclination to do this type of research. Then she goes on to state, this is not about the individuals buried underneath the chapel. Has nothing to do with the people buried underneath the chapel, she says. It is about the membership of SAC not being in a position of power. She closes and says, in peace, Council Member Houston, District 1. Now, I found this really disturbing. I ran across this through an open records request. It just kind of fell in with a bunch of other things. So the whole scope of her, she acknowledges that there may not be people, there may be people of other color buried in this area. But she says it's not about the individuals buried underneath or around the chapel. It's about control. She thinks that the membership of SAC is in some type of position of power. What an odd thought. SAC is a nonprofit 501c3 that works in conjunction with the City of Austin Parks Division. If it wasn't for the hard work and the years of research, ask Kim McKnight, she'll tell you, we could not have gotten the master plan done, or especially done for the cost that we got it for, because the majority of the work is already done by the membership of SAC. We don't own the cemeteries. We're guests there. We believe that everybody has a right to be recognized. But here it is. The councilwoman is making this an us against them issue, and she's worried about SAC having power. Now, the only power a nonprofit has is to lay out the facts and put it out there. If the city chooses not to accept those facts, then there's not much I can do about that other than bringing that to light and going, wait a minute, the people in leadership have been informed, and yet they want to follow an opposite track that is not true. Let's see what the city went ahead and did. So this is a brochure. This is one of the first drafts of a brochure that was made for Oakwood Cemetery. And you can see in this first draft here, here's North Street here. Let me come across this side. Here's North Street and here's West Avenue. And they've actually written in here A and B. And again, they've utilized the Bob Tiemann map. But they've utilized the colored grounds, the Mexican grounds, the paupers grounds, the strangers grounds. All of the titles that were used in the historic day books. Again, the day books don't have a map that shows how these grounds were laid out. You have to go by the existing headstones and make assumptions, very calculated assumptions, as was done by SAC. This is the final product. Again, a better picture. Now you can see here's North Street. They have obliterated West Avenue. West Avenue is a dirt road, but so is this a dirt road. They've removed the dirt road so they could tie the whole area in and call it the historic colored grounds. They did this on purpose. Now you'll notice the three little stars here. The three stars mark the locations of prominent African-American leaders whose graves you can find. But they're all on this side of West Avenue, whereas this was the historic colored grounds. There are African-Americans here, But this was the Anglos back here, Hispanics back up in here. The city chose to change this map in order to make this full inclusive so they can include these three people. So this is in section 4. This is from the city's map. You've got Cecil Anderson, who actually used to live right down the street, an educator. Jacob Fontaine, his star is not on there because we do not know where Jacob Fontaine is buried, although he does have an historical marker. Dr. Everett Givens, a dentist who was a civil rights leader, worked with LBJ, and he's buried in the north corner of that area. And then Ernie Mae Crafton Miller, who was the granddaughter of Cecil Anderson. And so those folks are all buried over close to the chapel, but the city needed to include that so they can include these 4 people as being in the historic colored grounds. So we see here in the official city brochure that they physically changed the look of the map in order to make it all-inclusive and claim that it's all the historic colored grounds, even though the SAC data clearly shows that it was segregated to Hispanics and whites, and of course people of color. Here in the brochure to the right-hand side of the map, you'll find an explanation that Oakwood Cemetery originally was segregated burials based on race and ethnicity. They agree with that. A portion of the section 4 north of the old grounds, well again, this part of the old grounds is in section 4, the original property. It's all called the old grounds. And adjacent to present-day chapel was set aside for the burial of non-Anglo people of color. That's a false statement, simply because there are Anglos behind the chapel. There's a whole area of Anglos behind the chapel. These were people who, the Bormans, for example, a father and son who were wagon jacked for a load of cotton. They didn't live in this community. They were found murdered alongside the road. They were brought up here as strangers and buried just north of the chapel. While it is believed that the majority of the burials in this section were African American people, again, there's no data to support that. They even go on to say that records lack documentation of who resides in this section. So the whole paragraph here is just one conflict after the other. It is known that cemetery interment records indicate section 4 was mostly referred to as the colored grounds. Again, there's no basis for that statement. As Oakwood Cemetery began to run out of space around the turn of the 20th century, it is possible that other burials took place in the historic colored grounds. Well, yes. At the end of the 19th century, burials of whites took place in the strangers' grounds. It wasn't known as the colored grounds there. The poor out-of-town visitors, others unable to purchase plots, may have also been buried here. The Bormans are a prime example of that. Historically, African American burial traditions utilized natural markers like wood, shrubbery, or flowers, which may have been lost with the passage of time. It is possible that paupers and strangers might have been buried here as well, and were not likely denoted with costly marker either. Therefore, parts of section 4 of the Oakwood Cemetery lack headstones or other visual markers. They've made my point. In trying to explain the color grounds, they've just put together all of my points. And so one has to question, why don't we make it something more appropriate, like the public ground? Because the councilwoman, the cemetery manager, and others in the community want to cling on to something that they can call their own. But in doing so, it hurts the reputation of the city when they knowingly make false statements and change things, because then other people come in and go, well, wait a minute, why is this whole area of white people buried in what you're calling the historic colored grounds? And then they'll just point to this here and explain it, and hopefully people believe it.